In 1988, I graduated from college and I went to Atlanta, Georgia, which was a bit of a culture shift, moving from Oklahoma to Georgia, a little bit more than perhaps I was expecting. But I had a really wonderful time in Atlanta for 2 years, and I studied at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, which is the United Methodist School of Theology there at Emory University. Emory University also has a United Methodist tradition, even though I think the plurality of students who study at Emory University are Jewish. The students in the seminary, all the way back in 1988, had a covenant that we all agreed to, which was perhaps a little bit before its time among United Methodist seminaries. And the covenant was an inclusive language covenant. So in the covenant, we agreed as students, and the faculty agreed to this as well, to use inclusive language both for God and also for humanity in our spoken and in our written discourse within the seminary community. This covenant was based on a recognition by the leadership of the seminary that our symbols matter and that inclusive language matters, especially if we have any hope of creating a truly inclusive, non-patriarchal community. I have to say, it was not easy for all of the students, or even all of the faculty, to adhere to this inclusive language policy. Most of us, including myself, had grown up in a religious tradition that primarily used patriarchal and monarchical language for God, such as Father, King, Lord, sometimes even Master. And in the 1980s, it was still common for most people to use male-dominated masculine language for humanity as well, such as mankind instead of saying humankind, or man instead of saying human or humanity. And it was also common in the late 1980s to still use masculine pronouns to refer to persons in general. The generic person often would be indicated with a masculine pronoun. Some students struggled mightily with keeping the inclusive language covenant. One of my friends in my class, who was from Mississippi in his early 50s, was one of those students who struggled mightily with this inclusive language covenant. And during almost every class in which he said something in relation to God or humanity, he would use the masculine language. And I can remember more than once this person asking a question and saying something about God and using the pronoun he, and someone, always someone in the class, almost always another student, would say, or she, and he would say, or she. And then in our second year of seminary, we were in systematic theology class, and it was a team-taught course, and one of the professors that day was giving a lecture about theological views of Satan. And she referred to Satan as he, and the student from Mississippi stood up and said, or she, which is, I think, probably a high point for him during his time in seminary. I also had one professor in seminary by the name of William Everett. We just read a few minutes ago from his book, God's federal republic. And Bill did significant work exploring the importance of moving away from monarchical and patriarchal language in our theological symbols and the language of worship. He and his wife, Sylvia, who I still am very good friends with today, both of them, they also worked together at a local church, and it just happened to be the local church that I worked in for my 2 years when I lived in Atlanta. And Bill and Sylvia led a service in the afternoon, Sunday afternoons, that was an inclusive language worship service. And no monarchical, no patriarchal, only inclusive language was used in that service. It was a service that I will say was ahead of its time in Georgia in the late 1980s, but it was extremely helpful in seeing that we need not be bound to the language of monarchy or patriarchy in our religious expressions. I should also note that Bill Everett has done some wonderful theological reflections that I don't have time to get into, but wonderful theological reflections on the governing symbols and systems of Star Trek in his work as well. So I recommend that work to you. He was very interested in the governing symbol, or the governing structure of federation and republic instead of thinking of things in terms of a kingdom. What Bill and Sylvia were recognizing is that if we believe democracy is the best form of government, why would we not talk about the democracy of God or the republic of God rather than the kingdom of God? What if religious communities understood themselves as freely electing to participate in the way of beloved community in this world, rather than seeing ourselves as subjects obeying a king above and beyond this world? It's not surprising that religions that developed in times where patriarchal and hierarchical cultures that were characterized by monarchical and authoritarian and autocratic political structures, it's not a surprise that those religions would borrow images and language for their understanding of the divine from their socio-cultural context. This is a contributing factor to why patriarchal and monarchical descriptors for the divine, such as king, lord, master, and father, are found in various religions that arose in such contexts. That's not surprising at all. What is surprising is that our religious imaginations have not expanded much beyond these symbols, and that we continue in some religions to almost exclusively use imagery from cultural and political systems that we no longer view as being good systems for the human community. If religion is about our ultimate concerns, or if it's about that which we value the most, and if our religious institutions use patriarchal and hierarchical language, and if they continue to be governed in monarchical and authoritarian ways, then aren't we saying that patriarchy and hierarchy are at the core of what is our ultimate concern? At the core of what our highest value is? Such a view of the divine and such systems of governance in religion perpetuate sexism, perpetuate inequality, and unjust economic and political systems within our societies. And they are used by the wealthy and the powerful to justify the status quo from which they benefit so much. We know from the evidence, we've talked about this together before, We know from the evidence that the happiest, healthiest, most educated, least corrupt, least violent, most equitable, and most ecological countries in the world are all what? Democracies. And not just democracies, they are the most vibrant democracies. But Christians, for the most part, keep clinging to hierarchical, patriarchal, and autocratic political images of God. And they continue to model hierarchy, patriarchy, and autocracy in church governance. And then we wonder why so many Christians are drawn to strong, mostly male, autocratic leaders, and why autocratic and patriarchal Christian nationalism keeps gaining a foothold within our societies. The evidence is clear that democracies are better. They're better for both people and the planet than autocracies or hierarchical and patriarchal authoritarian systems. If persons believe that the divine is good, and I think most people in their religious perspectives, when they think about the divine, whatever that may be for you, they usually want to think of the divine as being good. So if we believe, or if they believe that the divine is good, loving, and just, why would they want to continue using images of the divine from failed and failing political systems? Why would we want to aspire for the kingdom of God when kingdoms have proven to be so oppressive to so many for so long? Isn't it past time to move beyond patriarchy and hierarchy and embrace the image of the divine as a loving presence, a partner, and even friend, working with us for justice and liberation as we live into making beloved community a reality for all? The world deeply needs religious visions that model inclusion, community, and democracy rather than patriarchy, hierarchy, and autocracy. Visions that call us to look around and to join with others in beloved, just, and participatory communities rather than looking up and bowing down. And we find just such a religious vision so eloquently expressed in the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying together toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. May it be so.